So welcome everyone to this session on restoring land and ocean as an important part of averting climate collapse. I might just start by introducing myself. I've been working on climate emergency since 2007. I was a psychologist until I left to work on the climate emergency, and my interest in restoring landscapes came when I was writing this booklet, Don't Mention the Emergency, which was mainly about the psychology of emergency and the fact that we had to say it was an emergency. But as part of that, I had to look at how we could do massive amounts of drawdown. And that's where I got interested in landscapes and watershed restoration. So I'm going to just share my screen and a little bit about the emergency and why this all is important. Because basically we're at the climate and ecological emergency endgame. I did a talk with Violet Coco yesterday about this. We're running out of time. And so we're at the activism endgame, but we're also at the action endgame. This is something that scientists have been saying like for years and years and years, really. This is Sheldon Huber from 2018 saying that very soon we must choose between taking unprecedented action and accepting that it's been left too late. This is from Will Steffen before he died. This is a conversation he was having with Extinction Rebellion that he gave us permission to make public. On our present trajectory, we risk heading into a collapse of our globalised civilisation and a precipitous drop in human population, put simply, hell on earth. This is still not a perspective you hear enough in the media. I think that we'd have a lot more people in the climate movement if people knew how bad it is. But even World Bank back in 2012 makes clear that the idea of adapting to a 4 degrees warmer world is a nonsense. It's because of tipping points, because of momentum in the system, because of parts of the system that start to change, and beyond a certain point, it's like a ball running down a hill. It starts slowly, but it gets faster and faster. And beyond a certain point, you just can't catch it. And what scientists are saying is there's already momentum in the system where we are at just over 1 degree of warming. There's going to be a lot more at 2 degrees, and it's not clear we can stop it. Certainly by 3 or 4, it's all over Red Rover. And this was put most clearly for the first time in peer-reviewed literature in what's referred to as the Hothouse Earth paper. And they said very clearly that they can't rule out a cascade of feedbacks, runaway warming, before 2 degrees of warming. Now, of course, I don't think there's anybody much left who thinks we can stay under 1.5. And staying under 2 degrees is going to require the strongest possible emergency action, nothing less. So that's a picture from that paper with the planetary threshold. We're heading towards, it's like the edge of a waterfall, we're going faster and faster, and we're in danger of runaway warming. James Hansen's been writing about it recently because, of course, the thing that we've got is we've had 3 cooler La Nina years. We're heading into an El Nino, possibly in 2023 or 2024. And at that point, we're expecting a spike in global temperatures. We could blow through 1.5 right then. But anyway, there's no doubt that all the tipping points that are already tipping are going to be destabilised still further once we're in an El Nino year. So we've got to hurry. This is just one more warning. This is from Sir David King. He said when he was in Melbourne, we have only 3 or 4 years left to cool the Arctic. But not just the Arctic. We actually have to cool Antarctica and cool the Himalayas. We've got to stop all this ice melting and causing sea level rise, particularly from Antarctica and Greenland. And we've got to stop the glaciers in the Himalayas melting, because that's what a whole lot of people in Asia rely on for water. So we've got to get moving. But one of the concerns is what's called a blue ocean event in the Arctic. Now, having just a bit less ice, like it's already shrinking, why is that so bad? Well, it's, if you think of a saucepan full of ice blocks on the stove, and it's warming and it's warming and the ice blocks are melting, just before the last ice block melts, it's still quite cool. You can put your finger in that water. Shortly after the last ice block melts, it's so hot you'll burn your finger if you put it in there. It's close to boiling. Why is that? It's because until that last bit of ice melts, there's a whole lot of energy going into melting the ice. As soon as the last ice block melts, that energy is going into heating the water. So that's what we've got to stop. Another one that is very alarming is what we're doing to the ocean currents. There's already a 15% slowing in the ocean currents. That's to do with the melting of the Greenland ice here, and it's affecting this overturning here near Greenland. 15% slowing already. And the problem is that they're not going to just necessarily slow a little bit, a little bit, a little bit. They are close to a shutdown, which will affect everything. So what's clear is that we've got to take emergency action to reduce emissions. Yes, of course. No more coal, no more gas. We've got to change everything in terms of emissions to get them down as close to real zero as we can. But the fact is we're already past a safe level of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. We're past 400 parts per million. We've got to get back to 300 parts per million, or maybe 280. So we're going to need massive amounts of drawdown. And we've got to do some work to repair the damage. So what Sir David King is talking about, for example, is things like marine cloud brightening over the Arctic to save those last bits of ice. But what we're going to be talking about today is more about restoring the land and also some amazing drawdown you can do in marine environments. Now, one of the problems we've got with a warming world is these things that are being referred to as rain bombs, these massive rainfall events. And so we've seen a dramatic flooding in the Fitzroy River. It always floods, but this, at the Fitzroy crossing, the water was going through there was the equivalent of 20 years of Perth's water use. Lismore flooding, Dave's going to talk about that. New Zealand, floods and landslides, horrific landslides. We've got rain falling on the top of Greenland. Now, Greenland is a very, very thick pack of ice. This is the first time we've had rain falling on the highest parts of Greenland. And we've had rain bombs and extreme temperatures in Antarctica. Now, some of Antarctica is on the land and won't affect sea level rise. And will affect sea level rise. Some of it is ice shelves that are already in the water. But either way, it's a very serious thing to have these dramatic changes happening in Antarctica. One of the things that happens with these rain bombs, these dramatic flooding events, is also the very damaging loss of topsoil. It's damaging because we need that topsoil on the land, and it's damaging because the topsoil is going out into marine environments and damaging them. That one on the left is soil flooding out towards the Great Barrier Reef. Now, we've obviously got to revegetate the land. We've got to restore forests. We've got to restore grasslands. We've got to restore all sorts of environments. And that's partly for biodiversity, and that's partly for carbon storage. That is definitely important. That's the main thing that's usually talked about in terms of why we should revegetate the land. What if rehydrating the land and revegetating it could cool that area as well, partly counteract the effects of all that carbon dioxide in the atmosphere? Now, wouldn't that be amazing? Dave's going to tell you about that. Another thing that is, again, surprising, a very positive possibility, mostly when you hear about increased rainfall, it's talked about as an unavoidable side effect of the fact that warmer air holds more water. It does. It is an unavoidable side effect of warmer air. But what if by rehydrating and revegetating the land, we could play a role in moderating the extreme rainfall and redirecting the rain to where it's actually needed, ideally gentle rain, not rain bombs. Again, this is what this is about today. There's some quite amazing possibilities here. I'm just going to run through some really basic things. about water, which I learned from Dave. Some of them seem so obvious now, but there's a lot of the world that doesn't know them yet. Now, we all know that sitting under a tree is cool. That's partly because it's shade, because of the shade. But part of the reason that forests are cooler than deserts, even if they're at the same latitude, is because of something called the small water cycle. So it's actually to do with the cycling of water in the atmosphere near the trees and through the trees or the vegetation. So there's a cooling effect from transpiration as well as the shade. This is another thing which seems so obvious now, but I didn't know it. I always thought that forests grew where the rain fell, but in fact it's the opposite, that the rain falls where the vegetation grows. So if we can revegetate inland, we can actually draw more rain inland. There's a potential virtuous cycle. Now, one of the other things about heating is that hot landscapes drive away the rain. That's the converse of what I was just saying. Cool, vegetated landscapes can attract the rain. Hot landscapes drive away the rain. And this is evident in the southwest corner of Western Australia, where cutting down the kauri forests has dramatically dropped the rainfall. In contrast, the US Corn Belt is drawing rain inland. As they grow more corn and there's more vegetation, more rain comes. This is partly to do with a process called the biotic pump, and that's to do with differences in the pressure systems. Dave will explain it. But this is one of the really exciting possibilities. Hot, dry land, it seems, may well increase the extreme weather because it tends to produce steep pressure gradients. Whereas the latent heat stored in water vapour tends to smooth out the pressure gradients. Now, this is mainly what Dave's going to be talking about, but it's a very exciting possibility that by restoring the land, we can also have an effect on extreme weather via energy, via the change in how energy is processed through the land. Now, this is very brief. I'm going to just whiz through how things used to be different in Australia. If you Google water drains, what you see is pictures of chains of ponds. This is a picture of an actual chain of ponds. So this is how rivers in Australia used to look pre-colonial times. And the landscape was a lot more vegetated, and as a result, there was rain that was able to be drawn in over the ranges towards the inland from the east. This is the Tamanai winds. But what has happened to these chains of ponds? As we introduced grazing animals, the vegetation between the ponds got grazed out. As flooded, instead of the floodwater spreading out, it started to run down sharper, more defined channels until it looked more like the rivers that we know today. And the worst thing about that is that as water flows through fast, those rivers get in size, they get deeper. And as the water in the river gets deeper, the water table nearby is dropping as well, drying out all the landscape nearby. And this, sadly, was a conscious government policy. And we've removed apparently 96% of wetlands in Australia, including 750,000 just in the Murray-Darling Basin. A terrible mistake. Also, Indigenous people had fish traps that were slowing the water as well, and they were removed very early in colonial history. Wetlands were functioning like a plug in the landscape to stop the water draining from the higher land around. When you remove them, it's like removing the plug, and out comes the water from the surrounding landscape. And the damage was apparent very, very soon after its settlement. Like, this is just 10 years after some of this land was settled, you've got already these deeply eroded creeks. So water that used to take 100 days to travel through some land was taking 6 days, rushing through, taking the soil with it. So we can reverse it, and it's by using the methods that Dave knows about, including, it's Peter Andrews is one of the most famous proponents of this approach. This is Tarwin Park, and that's the boundary. You can see the green of Tarwin Park and the brown of surrounding properties. So basically what's required is to reduce the erosion, allow pioneer plants, otherwise known as weeds, to grow, recycle and grow the plants, growing and recycling the plants to build the topsoil, slowing the water so that it doesn't rush through the environment. But with leaky weirs, these are not dams. The water goes through as well as over and around. Gradually over time, with some rain, you get the aquifers and the floodplains recharged. And then you have water that's slowly released in the dry periods, much better for farming and for nature. And then you get the start of the small water cycle, short water cycle, which is the plants getting off, absorbing water during the day and getting it off in the night, and then it falling down as dew. And you also get building up of the soil via the flood debris. The wetlands are now filtering the flood debris, which actually improves the water quality as well. And damaging those upstream waterways is partly why we're getting downstream flooding of towns. Anyway, Dave's going to talk more about this and about how rehydrating and revegetating the land could moderate extreme wet rainfall, including things like the rain bomb that fell on Lismore. So now I'm going to hand over to Dave. Dave has studied a wide range of ecosystem restoration approaches, including starting off with natural farming by Fukuoka, also natural sequence farming as practiced by Peter Andrews. And he's done a lot of work on returning landscapes to pre-colonial status, including a lot of it voluntarily, some of it on Aboriginal land in New South Wales. But his particular interest now is atmospheric water cycles, and that's what you're going to hear about. Now, I'm going to be shifting Dave's PowerPoint for him. I'll just have to make it work.
That was great, Joan.
Oh, thank you. All right. So, go Dave.
Go Dave. Okay, so restoring the heat balance between the atmosphere and land atmosphere and the ocean. Maybe just pop on to the next slide, Joan. So presenting the case for rehydration of the world's, sorry, that second part of the first slide, presenting the case for rehydrating the global world territories. Basically, that's really a reference to some of the things that we looked at in the previous slides that were concerned with drainage. The landscape drainage processes are not something that's just happened in Australia. It's been a more or less, it became what's known as the global water paradigm of drainage. Essentially started when we first started practicing agriculture, and it's been a process that's been the development of, in the early Roman times with Romans and Greeks making plumbing and drainage systems. It became what was best practiced and used all over the world. So when we're talking about rehydrating global landscapes, we're really referring to all the areas that have been drained. So that image of a rain bomb, and then this next image is an atmospheric river. So in case we're unfamiliar with what things look like, this is an atmospheric river here. It's relatively new satellite imagery enables us to view these things more clearly. Okay, so in order to understand some of the case studies that we'll go into, we need to sort of understand a few of these sort of physical principles, I suppose. So the land atmosphere energy balance is the flux or the conversion and transfer from the sun to the land surface and back to the atmosphere. So on the left-hand side of this image, we're looking at a land surface that's hydrated, water saturated land surface, and with the arrows coming in, the large yellow arrow we can see is reduced as it's moving through the cloud system. So that's, if we were just to read that up there, it says the more water in the landscape, the more heat transported to the cooler layers of the atmosphere by evaporated water. So solar energy is coming in, it's evaporating water, it's producing clouds which further dissipate incoming solar energy. The red arrows, these red arrows are a type of heat that we'll familiarise ourselves with. That's we recognise red as a dangerous colour. Let's just jump to the left-hand side. That's a drained landscape. We're seeing less cloud production. We're seeing a greater amount of the red sensible heat, which is being produced, and less cloud cover as a result. So we're transporting less of the heat from the land surface back to where it can be cooled. So we end up with a greater amount of sensible heat in the landscape. On the left-hand side, we can see this big blue arrow. That's water vapor being released from the atmosphere, and we're not seeing it on the right-hand side. Hopefully that's made a bit of sense. Can we jump to the next slide, Jane? So we can see that on the left-hand side, we've got a large red arrow of sensible heat. That's related to a drained field. And on the right-hand side, we've got a large blue arrow with evapotranspiration. That's also known as latent heat, water vapor, evaporative. So evapotranspiration is the process of both transpiring water from plants or evaporation from a water body. So the one word incorporates the two processes. And the water saturated field is giving us 70 to 80% water vapor released back to the atmosphere. On the left-hand side, we're seeing 60 to 70% sensible heat. This is our dangerous heat that we're concerned with. There's something else in there I wanted to point out. Anyway, we'll move on from that, Jane. All right, so this one just gives us an idea of, on the left and furthest left, we've got 19.5 degrees. We've got a vegetated surface area, and that's largely the result of, in part, shading, but also the evapotranspiration, so the role of water vapor as air conditioning. So, and then 24.5 degrees, we've just mown off. You can see there's a fairly fresh mown surface area there. That's cut away the capacity for plants to transpire moisture, and also letting in more solar radiation at the surface, soil surface. And then if we jump over to the 43.8 degrees, where it's bare soil, you can see roughly there's 20 degrees variation in that between those temperatures. Now, if we were to consider for a second that we've cleared a third of the world's vegetation, or a third of the world's surface area that we've created, which looks more like the picture, the image on the right-hand side, 43.8 degrees, we can see that large-scale vegetation would increase climate temperatures. So if we were to upscale these things, can we go to the next slide, Jane? If we were to upscale the production of sensible heat, which was our red dangerous heat, this is more or less what the image is. So when I say upscale, I'm talking about at a continental scale. We can see that we start to produce what's known as a a hot air dome. So this is a dome of hot air that has little water vapor in it. It's all sensible heat. And on the right-hand side there, we can see the cloud being pushed around the outside of the dome. That's quite correct. The dome will actually hold cloud cover offshore or precipitation systems offshore. But the red arrows that go towards the top of the dome, they could just as easily be representing the gradients that are produced in the atmosphere. So when you have parcels of atmosphere of hot, dry air and parcels of atmosphere with a greater degree of water vapor in them, and that arrow, when they intersect, when the two collide with one another, the gradient can actually take the moisture vapor from the clouds, from the soil, from the grounds. It can start from the ground. It could also happen out of the clouds, take that water vapor up to around about 33,000 plus feet, where you'll see it drop as some of the hailstorms that we've seen over the more recent past, sort of, large-scale rain events, rain bombs, essentially. This is how that part of the process that creates them is the gradient between the two pressure zones. So we're talking about what things look like when we scale up this sensible heat production over a landscape. Can we go to the next slide, Jane? So this is the Australian continent in the middle of a drought season. Heat waves will be taking place. That heat dome that we saw in the previous image will be mostly centred around the centre of Australia. We can see the impacts on the hydrological cycle. It's holding the water offshore. So partitioning, I'm not sure how many people are familiar with it, but it's a fairly new climate observation, I suppose, in the last sort of maybe 7 or 8 years. We've started to see this as part of the language that we use to describe what's going on in the atmosphere, partitioning. So we're seeing cycles of, when I've written there, cycles separated by heat radiated off the devegetated landmass, I'm talking about a cycle of hot air and a cycle of wet air. So that partitioning is being caused by the landmass heat. It's something that's not very well recognised or discussed or even accepted in the scientific community as yet. Go to the next slide. So we're looking at partitioning again, but this bottom southern corner of Western Australia, that bare land is the agricultural land, and the cloud band actually follows the rabbit-proof fence. We've got native vegetation on one side of the fence and the cloud cover, and we've got more open bare ground. We've got less water vapor in the atmosphere. So there's that relationship. What we're seeing in that previous slide is the relationship between vegetation and cloud cover. All right, we'll go to the next one, Jane. This picture was put, this is part of the work done by Michael Krabick and Jan Courtney. They advocate for rehydration at a global scale also. The one thing that's missing in this image, really, we can see a green line at the soil surface which goes right down into the water. If that may well represent green vegetation on the landscape, but what's missing in this image really is a forest at the beginning of the coastal edge, because let's try and break this down a little bit. So some of the work that Michael Krabick did was on measuring small and large water cycles and global annual precipitation events. So over all of the landscapes of the Earth, the global average is 720 millimetres a year, and 410 millimetres of that 720 comes out of the small water cycle. So although the small water cycle is operating over the ocean, it's actually the role of vegetation and evapotranspiration to maintain the small water cycle over land. So from those measurements, we know that 65% of precipitation that arrives inland is solely the responsibility of plants for it to assist it to travel inlet. So if we go to the next slide, Jane. I might be talking too fast, and it's quite a lot of detail, so I'm aware of this stuff. But
No, I think it's fine.
This image here shows us how the forest system actually couples this, and this is a concept that science doesn't quite get just yet. The vegetation is actually coupled to the atmosphere via the water cycle. So the biosphere and the atmosphere have a direct coupling relationship. And as soon as we start to clear the vegetation, we can see that on the right-hand side, there's less precipitation. We've decoupled the atmosphere to the biosphere via plant removal and drainage, essentially. So this is probably one that we're not familiar with as well. This was an image that came out around, it was either 2018 or 19. It was when we started introducing some new colours to express the degree of heat on land masses. But what it's showing us is the heat is actually moving offshore and into the oceans around us. So most unfamiliar with most people, I would think, but land mass overheating actually does cause marine heat waves, and we're looking at this one. This is a major threat to coral reef systems. It's we're looking at they're quite sensitive to temperature increases, and this has been a heat wave over a period of time that's actually contributing to significantly to ocean heating, and also very significant plumes of water vapor being evaporated off the oceans. This is, it might be something that I need to drive home as we move further on, but this component of evaporation is not something that's looked at in terms of the water cycle.
Let's change over to show you that video.
Yeah. So this video wasn't made to demonstrate the biotic pump, but it does do it quite perfectly. And it was done in 2005. So we're looking at how the forest systems are actually pumping water from one forest to another. We're also looking at this little piece of Africa up here, the desertified area, and how in it, we don't, you know, on occasion there's precipitation events going through there, but mostly speaking, that land surface heating will direct the clouds around it. You see, we can clearly see that vegetation is responsible for managing the hydrological cycle. Yeah. Thanks for that, Jane.
Okay, now I'm just going to go back to the PowerPoint.
That's a good image, that one. You can see over the ocean there above North Africa where it's actually pushing the water vapor up around Africa. Yeah. 2005, that was done. Okay, this is an old report as well, but things haven't changed a great deal. The role of landscape processes within the climate assessment have been mostly ignored, except for in terms of carbon simulation. Now, I've kind of made it part of my homework to go through quite a few of the IPCC reports and try and get up to speed with what it is we know about this level of science. And unfortunately, although the IPCC reports on climate landscape interactions is what they call them these days, our level of work done in the area isn't sufficient enough to be scientifically certain. And this is why we hear very little about it. Unless you deep dive into the IPCC reports, you're not going to see any of this information. Well, not the information that I'm presenting to you, but the information in terms of land-atmosphere interactions. It's just the degree of science that's been done on it. So again, the previous slide was saying it's all right. It's okay, Jane. What I'm introducing here is a different set of, maybe an unfamiliar set of ways of viewing the same. If I can stop for a second, if I was to jump back in time, the way I learned my gig was that I had a few different people in my life that actually showed me how to learn, basically the things that weren't really being taught. And there's a couple of things that have been said to me along the way that really stuck in my head and took me a really quite some time to figure out. And one of them was, and it's not meant to be upsetting to anyone, but it's this idea that whoever your grand designer was, you had half a dozen good ideas and no imagination, and you went around replicating them everywhere. And it took me that was from somebody that I respected, and it took me some time to figure out exactly what it was he was saying. But what he was referring to is half a dozen laws and principles of thermodynamics that explain all the things that we're seeing around us in terms of climate occurrences. Go on to that next. The previous slide, Jane. Energy can't be created or destroyed. So this is one of the principles. Energy can't be created or destroyed. And with so the landscape had an opportunity to process the incoming solar radiation. Yeah. Stay back on that other one, Jane.
That was a mistake.
The landscape had the opportunity to process the incoming solar radiation via producing vegetation, growing plants. But if plants can't process the energy at the land surface, then the equivalent energy is re-radiated back into the atmosphere. So energy cannot be created or destroyed, but it can be processed through plants. Part of that processing is the production of water vapor, or the energy dissipation over land. Very important. All energy. So we can't use the first law. We can't use the first law without using the second law. They both work hand in hand, and the second law really talks about the way energy is transferred through. So the energy transference always goes from areas that are hotter to cooler, or in a parcel of atmosphere, from the lowest areas of evaporation to the highest areas of evaporation. So if we want to understand the direction that water vapor is going to move through the atmosphere, that's how we do it. It's from areas of low evaporation to areas of high evaporation, or from hot to cold. This structure that we're looking at, that's an energy, we define that as an energy dissipative structure. They occur far from equilibrium. It's when you have energy and matter produce just energy and matter. So the sun's energy and the matter is the soil, producing a structure in the atmosphere. That's non-equilibrium theory, I-Priogene. Then we've got order from disorder, and there's a whole bunch of things that you actually don't need to know about just to understand where we're going with the mostly in terms of the what we'll be looking at as we move on further. We really just need to know these components of energy transfer: hot to cold, low evaporation to high evaporation. So when we scale up a energy dissipative structure, which was the whirly, if you were to scale it up to the next size up, we might see a dust storm, and these events did happen in the next case study. So generally we're seeing hot move to cold, so offshore towards the ocean. What we're looking at through the atmosphere there is water and soil leaving the east coast of Australia on its way to New Zealand. Okay, Jane. So the 2019 Townsville floods, that was approximately 1.2 metres of rain in 10 days. So the prior records before that with basically they got an extra 300 millimetres of rain on top of their previous records. So 2019, this was really the beginning or part of the time when I started to observe a significant increase in the volumes of water coming down in, record-breaking rains, essentially. So what we'll be doing here is, in this case study, we're looking at how a heat wave will actually move across the continent. So generally in Australia, we'll see our heat waves start up around Marlborough in the top west-hand corner of northern Western Australia. They move more or less from that corner and come out around the bottom of the New South Wales Victorian border. They're more or less running diagonally across the country, but they will over time broaden and widen as they go. As the heat waves travel across the continent. That's fine, Jane. Go to the next slide. This has become pretty apparent if you're in Australia and you went through the last heat wave, the 2019-2025 season. This is what we saw as a common thing everywhere. All of our rivers became literally bone dry, and it's it's absolutely frightening. We don't see that these events are ecological collapse events. So, yeah. All right, so these are some of the reports that came out of New Zealand, just Sydney Morning Herald ones, but usually a very warm mass of air, usually a warm mass of air from my eyesight's terrible, I'm sorry. From the Australian outback would be cooled significantly by contact with the Tasman Sea as it moves across to New Zealand. However, this summer, with another marine heat wave underway, sea surface temperatures in parts of the Tasman were up 4 degrees warmer than average. The modifying influence of the lower layers of heated air has been significantly reduced. So we see the date on that, the 28th of January 2019. If we go to the next image, Jane, this is what I was looking at it on the 14th of February. Sorry, just go back one, Jane, for a second. That's 28th of January. Yeah, okay. Sorry, jump ahead again. This is the 14th of February. We're looking at this cloud band between New Zealand and the mainland Australia and New Zealand. That correlates with the heat transport off the continent. When we saw the marine heat wave, that's the zone that it was operating in. Again, you can see those big brown strips. That's all of our soil being sucked up into the atmosphere and tossed out into the oceans. Yep, we can go to the next slide, Jane. So the upper one is the 26th of the 1st. And we can see the streaming of heat between mainland Australia and New Zealand. If we look up to in the top part of Queensland there, we can see that we're still seeing onshore movement. Yeah. But if we come down a few days later, the 29th, we can still see this streaming, very solid streaming of water vapour between mainland Australia and New Zealand, and it starting to spin back up into the development of Cyclone Penny. But interestingly, the heat coming off, a moment ago I mentioned something about how heat waves will expand as they move across the country, and depending on how the severity and how long they're around for, their width across the continent widens. And we're starting to see where up in the top, looking at where the barrier reef would be, we can see, no, sorry, Jane, the picture below. Yes, this water vapour here streaming up into Cyclone Penny is actually reversed on itself. So the image before, we were seeing water vapour come onshore. As the heat waves come over, we're seeing evaporation and a contribution into Cyclone Penny there. So there's although they're not very well studied, this has been part of my research, but it's I would say that there, from my experience, there's a definite correlation between heat waves and the development of cyclones. It's one example of. But it's not, again, it's not a very well studied area. What have we got on the next slide, Jane? The case study 2, there was the North African heat wave, okay. What are we looking at here? We're looking at, if we go down to the bottom there, there's an acknowledgement by the World Meteorological Organization announcing that this atmospheric flow would carry scorching heat to Greenland. And then there's the volumes of water there. So how this one came about for me, I was sitting up late watching the Tour de France, and they had to stop the race because there was a massive hailstorm, and that was more or less triggered me into going, well, that's a sign for me, basically, there's something worth studying. So I traced it back, and we started to see reports that the heat wave actually occurred in North Africa. So I started to track it, and this is some information from a fellow called Paul Beckworth. He's a climate scientist. He's just using Earth Null School to present this, but these are just images taken from maybe 15 minutes of film. So that area over North Africa there's a small green circle. Can you see that, Jane? Yep. So at that point there, the land surface temperature is 41.3 degrees, and we can see we've written it across the top of the screen, but you can see it there. That's the one. Yeah. Okay, so that's land surface temperatures, and the next slide is land surface humidity. So we've got humidity over North Africa at 6%, and then the next slide, as we go offshore over the Mediterranean Sea, we can see humidity values has spiked to 76%. And then on,
oh,
what happened there?
Oh, I don't know.
Went back one. That's the one.
Yeah.
All right. So where our little green circle is now, we've just come across the Mediterranean Sea. We're just making contact with the coastline on the European side, and we can see immediately our values drop back from, what were we, 76%, now we're 61%. So we're looking at a depth in the amount of water as soon as that hits the coastline. So there's a different type of, that coastline is not vegetated. It's producing sensible heat rather than being vegetated and producing water vapour, which would be latent heat. So as we move over these regions, we can see humidities drop back to 26%. And the next slide is humidities drop back to 10%. So the question is, where's all this humidity gone to?
This one?
There we're just looking at the continents basically without all the other overlaying images on it to see, that area that we were looking at before was probably around Spain. Some of these coastlines, although if we were to zoom in closer to them, although there you can see them vegetated, as we get closer to we would zoom, we can't do it on that image, but a lot of this coastline is actually producing sensible heat, although you're not seeing it very clearly there. There's our missing water vapour. So on the right-hand side of the image, you get a much clearer idea of the capacity to stream water vapour. It's a little bit tricky for people to see because we can't see the outskirts of the continents, but that water vapour is basically coming off North Africa, off the Mediterranean Sea, interacting with the heat that's being produced off the landscape, being vexatiously transported up to higher areas in the atmosphere, and the process is known as advection when it moves from through the lower atmosphere. The higher atmosphere is already full of water vapor, and it's just steering it straight up and pouring it. Well, this is what makes it rain on the Arctic.
We're getting close to 12, but so we should move through these last examples.
Okay, that's some partitioning going on there. It's a heat off North Africa stuck there. It's just showing. Go on, Jane.
Sorry.
No, you're
Too
all right.
fast.
Go on. That's all right. That's okay.
All right, Lismore.
Lismore. These two get a little bit wonky because they're joined together, but that's okay. So over the top of Brisbane on the 26th and 27th of January, it was measured at 16 times the volume of Sydney Harbour moved through the atmosphere, and over those 2 days, the equivalent of 500 billion litres in Sydney Harbour. That's I don't like to swear, but we're talking a lot. It's a lot of water that dumped out. This is what eventually wet out the entire east coast, yeah. But Lismore was the one that was most heavily hit, I suppose. Aerial image of Lismore. Yeah, I travel across that bridge pretty regularly. It's best part of 25 feet to the normal water height from that bridge down to the bottom. So it's a considerable. This was the way out for people out of Lismore, basically. I think we might have crossed the point where we've talked about the increase in, for every degree of warming, we have 7% more water vapour in the atmosphere at 1.29 current. We've got roughly 9% more water vapour in the atmosphere than pre-industrial times. It's one component of climate change and heavy flooding, but also when we remove all of the wetlands, when we remove if we create the conditions for water to move out of the headwaters fast, well, it only arrives in the lowest area faster. So if we were to rehydrate catchments and slow the speed of water through the landscape, we would debit on the amount of water that's making its way into what becomes flooded territories. Right, Jane. So why this gets a little bit wonky is because of this 19 days separation period. So we had an atmospheric river in Lismore, and then 19 days in our region, we had another atmospheric river that melted the Congra ice shelf. This was that block of ice there is 1,200 square kilometres. It's the size of Rome, essentially, and it was attributed to an atmospheric river that began just below South Australia. Just a little reminder of what happens when we overheat the centre of the country. That hot air dome has the capacity to hold water offshore and produce a lot of water vapour to the atmosphere also. This is an image looking at the dates correlate to the atmospheric river. So we're seeing just down below South Australia there, that is the beginnings of the atmospheric river, that a little bit over to your left, Jane.
Sorry, one.
Yeah. That's the beginnings of part of the beginnings of the atmospheric river that melted the Cougar ice shelf. But what we're looking at, go back again, Jane. What we can see there is the export of heat off the Australian continent and how it's holding water, particularly moving off the West Australian side. You can see that the direction is offshore, right? So there's a blocking going on there. If we can just keep that in mind, that there's a blocking going on preventing the movement of water moving onshore. Okay, next slide, Joan. I'm not sure how that came in there. Next slide.
It's because I think you said the same thing's happening in the Arctic.
It is
yeah.
this overhead partitioning that we can see. It's a phenomenon that's relatively new in the scheme of things. Go to the next one, Jane. So that's the arrival of the atmospheric river that melted the Cougar Ice Shelf. Next slide. So generally what we hear is that most of the people that are talking about ice melt events, really our focus has been on warm water undercurrents melting ice. We haven't really been looking that closely into the atmosphere, and this is some more recent work. My suspicion, it is only a suspicion, that they're using a similar sort of going back through previous events. But yeah, that's the key. That's the take-home message. The underlying part there is that over 60% of all calving events from 2000 to 2020 were triggered by atmospheric rivers. Now, we're not hearing about this stuff. These are. Right, this is actually quite a busy picture. There's a lot going on in it. So, where do we start? If we're looking at the east coast of Australia, and we go back to what we were talking about with Lismore, what happened? What's important about Lismore is more what happened in the 12 months prior to that rain event. So the conditions were set up 12 months prior to that established the scenario that enabled the atmospheric river to arrive. This is it. So if we remember, we came out of the 2019-2020 bushfire season, which was followed up by above average rainfall for the East Coast. Some of it was flooding rainfall. And we're still 12 months away from the Lismore event. So, but this, if we're looking at that blue colour down the East Coast, in that 12-month period, we'll be seeing a similar sort of thing, that the coastline is actually being kept cooler, right? So under that situation where the landscape is cooler than the water vapour in the atmosphere offshore, yeah, try and just get that bit for a second. The landscape is cooler than the water vapour in the atmosphere offshore. So what that means is the water vapour starts to be drawn onshore over a period of time, establishing the conditions for when this atmospheric river that dumped on top of Lismore came down from the Coral Sea. It had to be pumped in there. It's bit of a trick to. We just moved down into if we're looking below the blue zone on Australia, and we can see where the heat waves come across. We see that red stream between the bottom part where I was saying that the heat leaves the bottom left-hand corner of New South Wales Victorian, the New South Wales Victorian border. That stream of red between and how it comes down off the bottom of New Zealand and aims into Antarctica there. But perfect, Jane. There's a relationship between that body of warm water and also below South Australia, the two of them combining there. The big red in the centre is the delivery of the atmospheric river when it melted the Cougar Ice Shelf. And the questions that I think probably answer themselves, but it's just something that I'd like to pose as a question is what would be the result were we to rehydrate the West Australian coast and make it look something similar to what currently the East Coast looks like. Basically, were the West Coast as blue as the East Coast, would that volume of water then have moved onshore? I mean, I believe it would have. I think there'd be a number of people that would get behind me and support me in that statement. And I think that we could actually debit the volume of water that went on to become an atmospheric river that melted an ice shelf. So,
okay, so we probably should pause and just see, like, this is very technical. Is there anyone who's got like a technical question for Dave? Just before I finish off with, you know, some of the practical applications of these amazing ideas in the real world. I've seen some gratitude in the chat. If you've got a question, stick it in the chat now, or we'll come. There will be, as long as I'm quick, there will be question time at the end. Unless there's an immediate one, I might just move on because my bit's sort of the less dense, more practical, climate activist-y sort of bit, right? So yes, Dave's is the science in a sense. It's the backing for what's just such an important area that needs more research, but it also needs more political support. So yeah, mine's the activist perspective about how can we use this, because like I said, we've got to not just get massive emissions reductions as fast as we possibly can. We've got to get massive drawdown as fast as we possibly can in climate repair. Now, fortunately, there has already been a history of these principles being used. This is in China, in the Loess Valley, where they had been doing agriculture for 3,000 years until we got to the 20th century and completely turned the place into a desert. But in about 10 or 20 years, it was possible to restore it using the principles of regenerative agriculture. There are people, of course, also working on restoring marshes and mangroves, very, very important work around the world. An exciting thing in Australia is that people who think along the same lines as Dave, you know, people who've worked with Peter Andrews, regenerative agriculture and watershed experts in Australia, have caught the attention of the person who used to be the Minister for Agriculture in Western Australia. She went and saw a property called Yanjet, which is up in the north of Western Australia. She actually dragged the Premier up there as well. And out of that, they got money to restore part of the catchment of the Gascoyne River, the largest river in Western Australia. Now, it's not all a done deal in the sense that there's still people trying to push things like levee banks and so on that are the opposite. They're basically ways of wrecking the river more. But upstream is some very, very exciting work going on to restore whole areas of the catchment, like many properties upstream in the Gascoyne. Very sadly, there was a very detailed proposal and that almost got up to restore large areas of the Fitzroy River, the one where the massive and destructive flood just happened. There's pushback from cotton farmers who want dams rather than watershed restoration. It hasn't got up as yet, but there's work going on and you never know. There's massive projects, which we were hoping we could tell you more about, that are right on the cusp of being approved to protect rainforests, but also to restore them using these principles, like hundreds, million hectare projects right on the cusp of being announced in Asia. The bit I want to talk about, though, is another incredibly exciting thing. This is coming from Peter Fiskowski. I'm so bad on names. He's saying this, and so is Sir David King. Yeah, you've got to do a 3-part program: reducing emissions at emergency speed, removing excess CO2 at emergency speed, and repairing the damage before it all spirals out of control. So yeah, Dave obviously has been talking about restoring the land. There's actually very exciting stuff we can do to restore oceans, which are, of course, also horribly damaged. And things like that Sir David King is working on, like marine cloud brightening over the Arctic, like I said, to stop runaway warming up there. This is a great book, which you can get a summary just for free online. I do recommend it, Peter Fiskowski. And the exciting thing, it's very short, it's easy to read. Peter has found 4 processes that can result in massive drawdown. I'll come back to them, but basically what he's arguing is that by mimicking processes that the Earth has used repeatedly to remove massive amounts of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, 10 times in the last million years, and many times, I mean, he's arguing this is the processes that are happening at the end of every ice age, at the start of every ice age. So yeah, he's selected 4: synthetic limestone manufacture, seaweed permaculture, ocean iron fertilisation, which has a bit of a bad name, but if you think of it as mimicking whale poo, I think it's very attractive, and methane release protection. So I'll just go through them very briefly because I do encourage you to read the book. He's looking only at methods that are permanent. You know, like we've got to restore forests, but let's face it, it's not permanent. You know, you can restore a forest and then it can burn down. These are permanent storage. They're scalable. That is, we can get them up to the size that's needed, and financeable. They're not horribly expensive, and some of them, in fact, pay for themselves. So isn't that amazing? First one is basically, apparently it's just really quite easy to use either waste CO2, that's the easiest, or to draw CO2 from the atmosphere and make limestone. And the world uses massive amounts of concrete. We could replace highly polluting concrete with limestone that's made out of CO2. And apparently it's hugely scalable and would pay for itself. Let's do it. Seaweed permaculture is one you might have heard about, which is the kelp forests. They grow massively. Acre for acre, kelp forests can draw down more CO2 than the Amazon, which is extraordinary, but they're dying. They're dying because of what we've done to the sea with the heating of the oceans, and some of the other damage as well. But you can grow kelp just on frames. And the thing is that by growing the kelp, you actually restore a lot of the life around, particularly fish life. Grow the kelp, you've got to actually pump cold nutrient-rich water from far down in the ocean. But this is very possible with pumps just powered by solar power. You pump up the nutrient-rich water, you grow your kelp, you grow plankton, you grow fish, and as long as some of the kelp eventually goes down to the depths, then you're doing the drawdown that comes just from growing the kelp, but also from dropping the kelp down where it goes into basically permanent storage. There actually are seaweeds, Sargasso seaweeds, that there's too much of them at the moment in the ocean, but you can make an equivalent of fossil fuel, liquid fossil fuel out of them. They're washing up on the beaches of resorts where they apparently stink. So there's a great possibility in terms of removing some of the excess that's there, but also growing more. But the one I really want to talk about is this ocean iron fertilisation. It's not an expensive or difficult process. The amount of iron you need is only really replacing the iron that used to be there. It used to get into the ocean from sand blowing in. Well, that's what they think. Anyway, for whatever reason, the iron in the water has dropped, and it's one of the things that's needed for plankton. It's partly to do with the sand, but it's also definitely to do with whales. So we've managed to hunt whales, kill whales, so that there's only about 1% of them left. And one of the incredibly useful things that they used to do was they used to go down where there's a lot of life down in the bottom of the ocean, feed down the bottom of the ocean, and then basically come up and poo. And you wouldn't think that's a big deal, but that was one of the major ways that phytoplankton got their food. And phytoplankton is one of the major ways that fish get their food. So the fact that we don't have whales bringing up whale poo to feed the phytoplankton is partly why we've had a massive drop in fish. Like, it's obviously also because we've massively overfished them. But I think at the point where we were killing off the whales, it was not well known just how absolutely vital they were. And the exciting story about this is that at any time, at any moment in the ocean, there's trillions and trillions of fish eggs just floating around, right? The fish eggs hatch at the moment. If they're in an area where there's no phytoplankton, they just hatch and they die. So it's a very easy task to restore vast populations of fish as long as you have phytoplankton. So the proposal is not to, turn the whole sea green or anything. It's to do it in ocean, what are they called? Whirly things, where they're relatively self-contained. What's it called?
Gyro.
Yeah, anyway, there's bits where the ocean goes round and it's like a garden. You can grow the phytoplankton there and you can have the fish eggs hatching and growing. And then what some people estimate is that 30 or 40 years of fertilising just areas of the ocean, not the whole thing, to replace the whale poo. And eventually you'll have the fisheries restored and the whales restored, and then they can do the pooing themselves. So it's an amazing prospect. And again, like with potential for massive carbon drawdown. And look, we don't want all the phytoplankton dying because they're partly what's making our oxygen. I won't go long into this one, but it's again a very, very important one. One of the big dangers up in the Arctic, if we keep on melting the ice up there, is small, medium, or maybe very large release of methane. Now, there's actually apparently very simple processes where you can accelerate the natural oxidization of the methane to break it down before it causes the 82 times carbon dioxide warming in the atmosphere. And these are to do with minerals that you could distribute in the sea just by putting them in the exhaust of ships. The whole of this program can be done for $2 billion a year, which when you look at what else we're spending our money on, that's for the whole world to do massive drawdown. His aim is to get to 300 parts per million in the atmosphere by 2050. And he thinks it's very possible. So why am I here as a climate activist talking about this? It's because politicians don't know this stuff. The research is not necessarily being done on this stuff. There's pilot projects, but not nearly enough on this stuff. So we need to actually activists talk to our politicians and insist that we get the emergency action that we actually need.
Thank you for your talk, Jane. It was fascinating, and some of it I knew, but I understood it a lot better. And what you explained about the rivers, I really liked. And it made me think of European beavers. That's what we need in our waterways to do that work.
We did have a slide on beavers and trying to cut it down to fit into an hour and a half. I cut out the beavers, but yeah, they're amazing. And they basically make leaky weirs. Do you want to comment, Dad?
I've kind of half jokingly said to people around me over the years that why wouldn't we just be, we've introduced every animal to this country. Why not? It's partially a joke, but you can imagine the work that could be done were we to do an international breed and release program. It would put a lot of us out of a job. They could just go and do it for us. It'd be marvelous.
Yeah, the picture that Dave here had in at one point was basically of a landscape that had burned, all except for this central bit that was all green. And that was where the beavers had built these leaky weirs, and that bit had been saved from the fire. Quite extraordinary. Anyway, in the meantime, we need to be the beavers.
Well, you can see that in Australia throughout the 2019-2020 bushfire season, it was 3 billion native animals that we lost because we weren't implementing this methodology back then. We just can't. They're collapse cycles that we'll never come back from. We won't bring those animals back from the extinction books. It's a very sad and unnecessary thing that happened.
There are large-scale trials of this going on. That's another one. I didn't quite get into mine, but the second bit. There's the people linked to Yanjit and Peter Andrews are doing a trial near Alice Springs, because one of the things that's been difficult is showing that this stuff works. If farmers have been paranoid that if farmers upstream put leaky weirs in, that would mean that they'd have less water. So that there are trials underway now just to show that it does increase the water in the landscape. It does cool the landscape, and it does increase the natural capital, which is, again, something that is a really important concept that people have not been able to really measure it up till now. Dave, do you want to say?
One of my personal struggles has been trying to, when people ask, you know, we need examples, we need trials, we need all of these things to understand actually how the landscape used to run before we started meddling with it, right? And that's the whole process of trying to put that history story about the land management practices that the land has never recovered from. You know, when we arrived, those plumes of soil weren't being dumped onto the barrier reef the way they are today. You know, and all the methodology that we have available can prevent that from happening. We just need to get out there and do it.
That's a good point to finish. So look, thank you everyone for coming, and thank you especially to our United States friend. Hopefully all around the world there are people like us that are working on this, and hopefully with the urgency that comes from knowing that we're in the climate endgame, we're in the climate and ecological endgame. Hopefully the people who need to put the energy in will put the energy in. Talk to people like this Minister for Agriculture in Western Australia, get this stuff happening. All right, but for now, thanks for coming, and thanks Dave.
Thanks very much, everyone. Thanks a lot, Jane.